Imagine a rat inside a small box. Every time it presses a lever, a food pellet appears. At first, the rat presses the lever by accident, but something interesting begins to happen. After a few tries, the rat presses the lever again and again. Eventually, the rat presses the lever almost immediately. It has learned something, but the rat was never told what to do. No instructions, no explanation. So the real question is this: how did the rat learn the behavior? This question fascinated psychologists for decades, and the answer led to one of the most important discoveries in behavioral psychology, a principle known as operant conditioning. But operant conditioning is not just about rats and boxers. It explains something much bigger: why we repeat certain actions, why habits form, and why some behaviors become automatic over time. To understand this, we need to look at a simple pattern. Every action we take is followed by a consequence. Sometimes that consequence feels good. Sometimes it feels unpleasant. And over time, those consequences begin to shape our behavior. This is the basic idea behind operant conditioning. Behavior that leads to positive outcomes tends to repeat. Behavior that leads to negative outcomes tends to fade away. At first, this might seem obvious. Of course, we repeat things that work. But the interesting part is how powerful this process actually is. Because most of our daily behavior is not guided by careful decision-making. It is guided by reinforcement. Operant conditioning was studied extensively by psychologists. B.F. Skinner designed experiments where animals interacted with simple environments. Inside what became known as a Skinner box, an animal could perform small actions: press a lever, peck a button, turn a wheel. Each action produced a consequence. Sometimes food appeared, sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes the environment changed. What Skinner discovered was that animals quickly learned which actions produced desirable outcomes, and they began repeating those actions more often. This process revealed something fundamental about behavior. Learning does not always require instruction. Sometimes learning happens simply because the environment rewards certain actions. This brings us to the core mechanism of operant conditioning: reinforcement. Reinforcement is any consequence that increases the likelihood of a behavior happening again. If an action leads to a reward, that action becomes stronger. The brain begins to associate the behavior with the outcome. Over time, the connection becomes more automatic. There are two main ways reinforcement can happen: positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Despite the names, both actually increase behavior. The difference lies in what happens after the behavior. Positive reinforcement occurs when something desirable is added. Imagine a student receives praise after completing homework. That praise acts as a reward. Because the behavior produced something positive, the student is more likely to repeat it. Negative reinforcement works differently. Instead of adding something pleasant, it removes something unpleasant. For example, imagine a loud alarm in a car that continues until you fasten your seatbelt. The moment you buckle the seatbelt, the noise stops. The removal of the unpleasant sound reinforces the behavior. You are now more likely to buckle your seatbelt quickly in the future. So even though the word negative might sound like punishment, negative reinforcement actually strengthens behavior. On the other side of operant conditioning is punishment. Punishment works in the opposite direction. It decreases the likelihood of behavior repeating. Just like reinforcement, punishment can also take two forms: positive punishment and negative punishment. Positive punishment occurs when something unpleasant is added. A speeding ticket is a simple example. The unpleasant consequence is meant to reduce the behavior. Negative punishment removes something desirable. A child who loses access to their phone after breaking a rule experiences negative punishment. Something valued is taken away. The goal is to reduce the unwanted behavior. At this point, operant conditioning might seem straightforward: reward good behavior, discourage bad behavior. But the deeper insight lies in how reinforcement shapes behavior over time. Because reinforcement does not only influence single actions, it can gradually shape complex behaviors. This process is known as behavioral shaping. Instead of rewarding the final behavior immediately, reinforcement is given for small steps that move in the right direction. Animal trainers use this method constantly. A dog is not rewarded only when it performs the full trick. It is rewarded for partial progress. Each small step moves the behavior closer to the final outcome. Eventually, the complete behavior emerges. The same principle applies to human learning. Skills are rarely learned all at once. They are built through reinforcement of incremental progress. Now here is where the deeper pattern begins to appear. Operant conditioning is not just about external rewards. It is connected to the brain's internal reward system. Inside the brain, certain neural circuits respond when an action produces a positive outcome. One important signal in this system is dopamine. When the brain detects a reward, dopamine activity increases. This chemical signal strengthens the neural pathway associated with the behavior. In simple terms, the brain marks the behavior as important. The next time a similar situation appears, the brain is more likely to trigger the same action. Over time, repeated reinforcement strengthens these pathways. This is one of the reasons habits form. The brain learns that certain actions reliably produce rewarding outcomes. Eventually, the behavior becomes automatic. This helps explain many everyday behaviors, why people check their phones repeatedly, why video games can become so engaging, why gambling can be so addictive. Many of these systems rely on reinforcement schedules. A reinforcement schedule describes how often rewards occur. Interestingly, the most powerful reinforcement schedules are not consistent ones. They are unpredictable ones. When rewards appear randomly rather than every time, behavior becomes even more persistent. This is called variable reinforcement. Slot machines use this principle. Players do not know when the next reward will appear, but the possibility of reward keeps the behavior going. The brain continues to chase the next reinforcement. Understanding this pattern changes how we think about behavior. Many people assume behavior is driven mainly by willpower, but operant conditioning suggests something different. Behavior is strongly shaped by consequences. If a behavior is consistently reinforced, it tends to grow stronger. If reinforcement disappears, the behavior slowly weakens. This is why some habits are easier to build than others. A habit with clear rewards forms quickly. A habit with delayed rewards forms slowly. Exercise is a good example. The benefits are real, but they are delayed. Because the reward is not immediate, reinforcement is weaker. Compare that with social media notifications. The reward arrives instantly. Each notification reinforces the behavior of checking the phone. Over time, the habit becomes automatic. This leads to an important shift in how we understand behavior change. Most people try to change behavior by focusing on motivation. They assume that if they try harder, behavior will change. But operant conditioning suggests a more effective approach. Change the reinforcement structure. Instead of relying on willpower, modify the consequences that follow behavior. Increase reinforcement for desired actions. Reduce reinforcement for unwanted ones. When the reinforcement pattern changes, behavior gradually changes as well. So the next time you notice yourself repeating a behavior, it may be worth asking a different question. Not why am I doing this, but what reward is reinforcing this behavior? Because somewhere in the system, reinforcement is usually present, and that reinforcement may be shaping the behavior more than you realize. Understanding operant conditioning reveals something powerful about learning. Much of behavior is not guided by conscious planning. It is shaped through repeated interactions between action and consequence. The environment teaches the brain which behaviors matter, and over time those behaviors become patterns. Patterns that form habits, patterns that influence decisions, patterns that define daily life. But this leads to another important question. If consequences shape behavior, then how do repeated behaviors eventually become automatic habits? And why do some habits become so difficult to change? That is exactly what we will explore in the next video. Because understanding operant conditioning is only the first step. To fully understand behavior, we need to examine how habits form. And that process reveals an even deeper system inside the brain, one that quietly shapes much of what we do.